How would you like to replace your full-time income with the revenue you generate from your websites? Quit your job and move to Europe. Well, that's exactly the story of Marty McLeod, who we have joining us today on the Niche Pursuits podcast. Marty has a wonderful story which he goes through for us. One which starts with him mired in a full-time job that he did not like, wondering about how he was spending his time. And he sat down and he purposed to use websites as the tool to get him out of the path he was on. And so Marty walks us through the process he went through several of his initial failures, finally to landing on the sites that he has in his portfolio right now. Again, where is he at now? Well, he's been able to leave his full-time job. He's been able to move to Europe, and now he is a full-time website builder who relies exclusively on his websites for his income. Marty outlines a lot of really, really wonderful insights about how to pick a niche and how to avoid making some of the mistakes that he made in his initial couple of website failures. We talk a lot about how to validate a niche and how to identify who is a competitor and what makes a competitive niche. We go through keyword research, primarily looking at low competition keyword research and some different tactics to find those low competition keywords. We talk about how to use various operator tools like All in Title to find the keywords that are easy to rank for. We also spend a good amount of time talking about page speed improvements that you can make, what the primary drivers are that affect page speed, and where you can get the best bang for your buck if you're looking to make your site a lot faster. Along the way, Marty's just a huge encouragement and has a lot of really positive things to encourage those who are at various spots along their journey when it comes to website building. I think you're going to like what Marty has to share, and looking forward to sharing the interview with you. Welcome to the Niche Pursuits podcast, and I'm joined today by Marty McLeod. Marty, how you doing?
Hey, pretty good. How's it going?
Good. Good to have you join us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, we've got a good one here. I am just especially interested in hearing not only your story, but also your background in terms of where you've started and where you are now. I think everyone's going to get a lot out of this interview. Going to be a lot that's applicable for everyone, for those listening, all the way from just thinking about entering the website space, all the way into people who are building websites, maybe have more than one website and are looking to grow them. Let's start off. Let's hear about your journey. Tell us where you started and tell us, where you were at before you got interested in website building.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm like a lot of people. There's a lot of people out there who may not mention it out loud, but I was one of the very same people who were just daydreaming of finding a better way because I hated my job so much, or just the daily drudgery. The routine was, I know it sounds like a cliche, but soul sucking is what people say sometimes. But basically, I was an electrical engineer. My degree is in electrical engineering, but I also studied electronics and some things like, microcontrollers, small scale CPUs and stuff like that, and as a hobby, and I ended up working in that professionally later. The problem I ran into is and I changed companies several times, was that even though eventually you can get to a good rate of pay, the kind of work I was doing made me miserable a lot of times. And a problem that I ran into sometimes was, I don't know if it's just engineering, or if it applies to other career fields too, other types of businesses, but more than once I worked under a boss or someone like that who typically was an older guy who was a very smart person, but unfortunately he made my work so hard because they felt that their way of doing things was the best way, and they would try and reinvent the wheel, so to speak. And it just made my life just that much harder. Technical stuff is really hard to work on sometimes, especially I would struggle. My last job, I would struggle just fighting to get the tools to work, just so I could get back to actually doing the work. And on a really bad day, that was 3 levels high. It would be my work, then the tools, then something related to that. So I would have, this was something that would happen every so often, plus long hours and stuff, because fortunately I wasn't given the ability to input to some design decisions, and it made what we were trying to do, which is kind of shoehorn something into a way it wasn't really originally intended to be used, when there were other alternatives, in my opinion, it made things so much harder. And I thought to myself, here I am again, and I'm not very happy. And sometimes I'm working here by myself when it's dark outside, struggling with this stuff. And, after stuff like that happens after a certain amount of time, number of times, you start thinking, is this really how it's going to be the rest of my life? Is this going to be it? For example, I used to work in the same city where Doug Huntington originally used to work before he went into affiliate marketing, which is Alpharetta, Georgia, coincidentally. And so back about that time is when I first started thinking, I remember going outside one day in the sunshine in my car, just taking a break because that was my escape from the drudgery of the day. And it was kind of sad, but I would go outside and see this wonderful sunshine and people out leisurely doing their things. And I thought, wow, just imagine what it must be like to have the freedom to go out in the middle of the day. I had no idea what that was like. I got curious and started searching online about how to make money online. And then, like a lot of people, I drug my feet a little bit, but then I did eventually try a few different things. I think the first three did not work. One was like two forays into trying out drop shipping of two different types. My first niche site, I picked the wrong niche because I didn't know what I was doing, and that flopped. Right away, I could tell that was a bad idea. So I didn't give up, and I stayed motivated because, whether you have positive motivation or negative motivation, sometimes even a negative motivation is some of the strongest because if you're so uncomfortable, so unhappy with something, you can sometimes be extremely driven to continue. Mm-hmm. And that was part of what did it for me. So it was a little bit of both, I'd say. So eventually in 2017, I took Doug Cunnington's 5-figure niche site course because I said to myself, okay, you know what, maybe I should give this a shot and try to learn from somebody who's already doing it. And Doug wasn't one of the quote unquote gurus out there because it's, back at the time, there was so much noise out there and so much junk. In my opinion, it made us a little bit better now. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but so it was a good choice because I started off with the KGR or keyword golden ratio approach. And then I started my first website, and I think it was less than a year later, I started a second one, which is the one that's earning the most of my money these days. And so at the end of 2019, I had come back. Let's see. So it's only been a little bit over a year and a half. I finally get to the point where I was making enough money originally from Amazon affiliates, and then later some from display ads also. I was able to get to the point where I had to make that decision. I'm making enough money to get by. Maybe it's time I should leave my job, and I did it. And so here I am.
Wow. That's And so you are a full-time website builder, affiliate marketer right now, right?
Yes, that's right.
So you walked away from the job and the career that you had, basically despise.
Yeah, and it's sad because I think my mother and my whole family tree is the only person with a college degree, but she never worked professionally. She worked different jobs, but she raised a family also that raised a family. But so it was really hard to get to the point of earning my degree. I worked very, very hard to get that, and then to find out that the things that you thought were so fascinating that you want to work on professionally, that in reality, the reality of the job, unfortunately, means it's not going to be like that at all. The day-to-day grind can be very depressing, sadly. I hate to say that, but it's just the reality of how things are in the world sometimes. I'm sure not in every case. And they were nice people where I last worked at, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I just kind of find myself in a different flavor, a different version of the same thing, you could say. So as much as I enjoyed the people and stuff, I knew that my dream was to have control over my own destiny, my own life. And especially with the inspiring stories out there, like from Spencer Hawes and Matt Tiggety and a lot of the top guys who are extremely successful, it shows you what's possible. And when your mind is open enough to say, hey, this is possible, and not instantly, deride it and say, no, I'm sure I couldn't do that. But if you feel like you just know something's possible and it can be done, you can say, wow, things go well. I could do even better than I ever did before. So sure, there's a little bit of risk making a big decision like this, but there's so much more. The upsides are so awesome. You you have to get to the point where you know that you have to make a personal decision about what you really want to do or not. Because I try to tell people that for beginners, because I started in my group when I started, they were, I don't know what, maybe 25, I don't know, it might have been 30 people, but in every case when I've been in a group of people who were getting started in this line of income, at the end, in only 2 to 3 months, there's such a tiny portion of those people still remaining, still pushing forward. So I try as hard as I can to try to encourage people and to make them think hard about their decisions before they want to give up. And I always try to tell people, listen, it's not always easy, but I try to cite examples and say, if these people failed 10 times and then they were successful, wasn't it worth it? And that's what you have to plan for. And I try to say, listen, how badly do you want it? If you want it bad enough, you'll find a way to make it happen eventually.
Touching on that, because I think you touched on something that is a prevalent challenge with website building, which is that it takes so long for not only the payoff, and so long,
Yeah.
I mean, depends on how you put it, but it takes a year typically, we'll just say, before you really start seeing some really tangible results that you can kind of start to bank on. And then you have to learn along the way. You talked about your first website. I'm right there with you. My first website, I thought I had it all figured out with all the podcasts I'd listened to, and didn't go well. I made every mistake in the book, I think. But I mean, with all these factors at play, do you think that in your case, you needed to drudge along in your job for that length of time to really build the desire to push through in website building on the side? Or was it something where you arrived in a moment and it was the arrival and the culmination of things that allowed you to push through? Because I think it's important to touch on, people don't finish what they start in this area of the world. And I think you're touching on something, and motivating people to do that is really important.
I would say that I know that everybody's situation is different. It's impossible to account for all the variables and going on in somebody's personal life, work life, personal life, whatever. But I can say that I think it was a combination in my particular case, because doing the daily thing was a constant reminder of why I wanted to keep going. So I had that constant reminder every day. And originally I had hoped to leave my job sooner, but I also had a plan, because what I like to do sometimes, if I don't know something and I feel like I should get a second opinion, I asked 2 guys who were very successful online and had been well known on the internet. And I said, hey, I've read that I should get the income to X point and have some savings too. And they both said, yeah, that's the best way. Now, you don't have to do it that way, but that's the best way. And I thought to myself, I'm going to try to do this the right way. So I set my plan was I would hang in there until I met the first income goal, which I did. That was fine. But then I said, I'm going to go a little bit further and make sure I can get by for, say, 1-2 years, depending on where I live, what country I live in, maybe even more. So that if I had to start all over again, if the bottom falls out, I can do it. That was one of those best pieces of advice I've ever heard. So in that case, it was a combination of things.
It was a combination.
But definitely the motivation to get out. Well, one of my things on my list was the ability to finally be able to travel somewhere and not have to go back in 7 days. Like when you have a regular job, I didn't get many vacation days, unfortunately, like some other people. So it always sucked when I was going somewhere, had a great time. And in 7 days, when you finally get started, you're finally getting comfortable and even speaking some language. Guess what? Sorry, I got to go get on my plane tomorrow. So, nah. Yep. So
day 7 is always day 7's about when I stop reaching for my phone. It's like it takes me about 7 days to like not have that knee-jerk reaction to check something on my phone or something, and then you're heading home.
Yeah.
What are some of the mistakes, just rapid fire, like what are some of the big mistakes that you made in some of your first websites? Like I said, we've all been there, but I'm just curious, what are some of the big mistakes that kind of train wrecked that first site?
Well, I'm sure I could go down a long list, but I'll try to get to the main bullet points. So this, without question, my first site, that reminds me, there were actually 2 sites. First one I did myself. I picked the wrong niche. And while there's an enormous amount of monthly search volume. It was, as you probably could guess, hyper competitive. So for a brand new site trying to compete in that, especially for a beginner who doesn't understand the ins and outs and had to see patterns like you get with experience, especially with keyword research or yada yada, that wasn't a good idea. And I see a lot of other beginners make the same mistake too. Something is just too competitive, or there aren't many keyword opportunities out there that you're going to realistically rank for without a lot of investment of time and possibly money too. It's just not a good plan, in my opinion. You know, second one, I bought a ready-made site that, you know, quote marks, should have been a good one because supposedly it was a good, you know, the assumption was when these are sold, and I won't name any names, but that it was a niche that is going to be lucrative. But I held on to it for a while, and I went back and once I got some experience, I went back and started looking through keywords, and guess what? There was so few lower competition ones out there that I said, you know, I think I need to make a decision. I think I could pick something better. And so that's what I did. I got rid of it and just moved on with it. My two main sites and then the new stuff.
I have also picked up a pre-made site before back in the early days and had a similar experience. Yeah. It's
really?
Yeah. I think you're right. In general, the keyword opportunities were there, but there wasn't much in terms of low competition, at least with a particular niche that I ended up getting into. It ended up being a very competitive one. And I'm sure now I would have been able to do better with it because I have better chops in keyword research. But like you talked about, if you don't know how to find the low competition keywords, you have to put in quite an investment of time and money to get that return.
Yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah. Being able to look at the big picture is really so crucial sometimes, you know. And I've had people, it's been a while, but I've had people send me, they'll have a website with, gosh, one time it was like they'll say 59, 60 posts, and another guy had one with 100 or more posts. And I went through the list, I ran them through Ahrefs, and doggone it, man, these things were so competitive, and they weren't ranking for any of them on the first 20. Or I doubt they were even getting past second page. So that's rough. And that was a red flag. And I remember just several times writing about this, I had some bad news. Sorry, but these are all too difficult for a site as young as yours to rank for. I would suggest you go about this a different way. So yeah, I guess the point is, don't feel bad if you make mistakes because it's part of the process, right? But I certainly don't recommend going all in until you feel a bit more confident.
What you're saying is don't quit your full-time job, don't quit your day job until you until you have a pattern of success. I bet that also made it a lot. It made it a lot less anxious when you did get around to, I think you said 2019, walking away from your full-time job and being able to commit yourself fully to building websites at that point.
Yep, that was.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I was just gonna say, yeah, definitely.
I mean, so when did you start the site that is doing well now? You talked about how you had a couple failures and then you had a site, you have a site, you have it still.
Yeah.
It's your main moneymaker is what you were saying. When did you start that one?
Well, technically I have two. So I call them my main sites because those are the ones I wrote the content on, at least almost all of it. Maybe on one of them, only 10 I didn't recently. But sorry about that. What was your question?
I was just wondering, when you started these sites that are now working, that are now in your portfolio, that you turned the corner and these sites are now successful. Right. When did those start?
Okay, so the first one, because the second one didn't exist at the time. It took me it was something like 7, 8, or 9 months before I even started seeing some pennies roll in. Granted, I could have gone about it if I knew then what I know now. It would have been faster. But sometimes it does just take time for the traffic to start rolling in. And at the time I wasn't getting out content as well because I was still a beginner and writing was harder for me at the time. So by the middle of the next year, I think at that point it was making a couple $100. And it didn't take long for the second one to make too much either. It only took, my second one for some reason took a little bit less time to come out of the sandbox. And I also started off with 20 posts. I even took a weeks worth of vacation days and knocked out the majority of the posts for the sandbox content for my second site when I made it. Kind of going by what I learned from my first one. And so it was making, it didn't take too long. The first site was making, it was, let's just say it was about roughly 2 years before I got to the point between the two that I was making enough to say, okay, I'll be all right. I can leave my job.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you talked already about how one of the bigger mistakes with the first ones, the failures, was niche selection, picking a niche that's too competitive. How did you go about picking the niche for these two sites that are successful now? And, what kind of tips do you have for people in that stage of picking a website?
Yeah. And then the same applies to my new project too, which is a new site I started. So what I do was I go through, and I know that not everyone has the same tools, but ideally you'll go through either with a tool or manually and you'll do some keyword searches and you'll make a note. I do it in a spreadsheet. I make a note of the competition of very similar domains, websites out there, and make a record of their domain authority. And we're not trying to get perfect numbers here. We just want to have a general gauge and start going through until you get a long list. Just keep going in iterations of more and more and more. And after a while, you have a list. Let's say ideally you have at least 20 competitors out there, and you can look at that group and say, is this a mix of high authority, very competitive ones, or there are some lower, weaker ones in there too? And if there's at least a relatively fair amount of weaker sites or even new sites in there, then I see that as one of the criteria is okay. It's a green light on that. And then I go through and try to do a lot of keyword searches and see what keyword opportunities are out there that looks to me like I can realistically rank for it. And I base that off of this in the search engine results page, first page of Google. I use a SEO Quake extension for Chrome, and it'll give you some of the stats of the ranking URLs in the websites. And you can look at that first page and say, are there any weaker sites ranking? And if so, that's often nothing's 100%, but it's often an indicator that you stand a chance as well. So I go through and make a list of those plus the search volumes. So I say, when it's all said and done, I'll have an idea about what the competition is like. Is it weaker? Is it medium? Or is it very strong? And are the keyword opportunities out there that I think that I can rank for? Yes or no? And are the search volumes okay? Like, is this nickel and dime stuff? Is it like teeny tiny search volumes all across the board for the most part? Or is it some low ones, some high ones, like a normal niche you might find? And that, I think those are some of basically the biggest criteria. But I've heard other people say the same thing. It's just a matter of doing your homework. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of people, I've noticed a pattern over time, and it's not just niche sites, but it could be e-commerce and other stuff. But it tends to be that people who are starting, they tend to be drawn to the same niches for some reason. And I was guilty of that as well. And I really, really, really strongly recommend you make a long list, and then you potential ideas, and it's going to take you time, but it is important, and just go through and evaluate those. And even if that list, you can't find a good one, start thinking outside the box, go in a store, take notes when you're out and about. If you just get an idea that you could research later, go in a store and look at, for product ideas or niche ideas, just walk around and be open-minded. You have to kind of get out of the consumer mindset and more into opportunistic mindset, like, instead of I'm looking for something specific, or I'm opening to seeing different things. Mm-hmm. I've noticed I had to do a little bit of a change there.
You get stuck in a box thinking about the same 5 things you're passionate about, or the
exactly
basis. Yeah.
That's right. And
so you talked about low competition, right? And you talked about how you evaluate these, and just to put like maybe somewhat of a definition for people listening. What would you call like a lower competition score? I mean, I heard you use domain rating and those kinds of things, but like, what would be a low competition threshold for you to consider to be, okay, that's something that meets my criteria as, lower competition from a domain standing?
Okay. I don't really rely on a keyword difficulty score as a quote unquote real filter, quote unquote. I use those occasionally just for general filters. And there's a reason why I don't use them regularly, but to me, low competition would mean something that when I export my keyword list and I go through potential low competition keywords and to evaluate, I look at things like, one idea is you can use the all-in title value, which is a parameter you can use in a Google search to return roughly the number of other URLs with that same keyword in it. To give you the ideas to get a ballpark idea of how many sites there are out there with that you might compete against. I also go through and like I mentioned earlier, I also check the search results directly for that open incognito tab. And I have to use a VPN here because I'm not in US, but I set to USA and I search and I see how strong the sites are that are ranking for that term. And if it's not as much now, but in some years ago, there used to be a lot of web pages when it was a keyword with almost little or almost no legitimate pages ranking for it. There might be some garbage websites for these they're just jammed with keywords. They're not a real website per se. If I see those ranking, that usually tells me, or a forum answer, things like that tells me that there's not that the algorithm hasn't found a better one to rank above that, and that this is very likely a good opportunity. So I actually don't really, these days, for my new project, I don't really pay as much attention to search volume either, because some are quote 0 or 0 to 10, or even have not enough data listed. But as some people may already know, that a lot of your posts, you're going to rank for multiple keywords, and I tried to do a good job of the content. So just because a keyword has an estimated search volume of 0 or 10 or whatever the case might be, doesn't mean you're only going to get in that ballpark. A lot of times it'll go to several hundred or even more, much, much more, as a matter of fact. So that's something to bear in mind. Is it nice to go after very high search volume keywords? Yeah, sure it is, but it comes with a price, because there's almost always somebody else going for it too. And they've probably been out there for years. And if you're starting off, you have to compete against that. And then you might have to build backlinks, and how much money and time you're going to spend on that, and yada, yada, yada. So the alternative is to go after these long tails where there aren't many competitors ranking for it, if at all. Sometimes there's not any. And even though they may be low search volume, there are a lot of times are great opportunities.
I heard a story recently, and it really piggybacks on what you're talking about. I heard a story from someone who now is really successful in owning a portfolio of websites. One of them making 5 figures a month, so doing very well. Their first site, looking back on it, was one they started, and they did target very low competition, a very low competition niche, and a very low competition keywords, very long tail keywords. And what they ended up doing was, as a result, they targeted too low. It was too small of a niche, and it was too low of competition. Almost the exact opposite of what you talked about mistakes being, which is going after something too big and too competitive. And in the end, though, they were still very successful with that first website, and they did hit a ceiling, but then they sold it and took those funds from selling it and used it to start their next project. Now that they knew and understood more, and they were able to go after a little bit more of a broader niche. And it sounds like both of us have had failed ventures where we started something too big, and really weren't able to salvage it, right? It's just not ranking for anything. And so it almost underscored the point you're making, which is that low competition is such a great approach for niche selection, especially if you're just starting out.
Yeah, and I know one lady. She doesn't really. Well, she does have a website, but she's not like well known on the internet or anything. But she is originally from Israel, and mad respect to her. She followed the same pattern and approach as John Dykstra, the Fat Stacks guy. Mm-hmm. And I've been following him for a long time too. So my new project is kind of doing the same thing, but she also is extremely successful now, just doing the same thing. And it's a niche let's say one of her original sites is in a niche is broad enough that you could just keep knocking out those lower competition keywords. So again, that reaffirms the point that the niche is important. Like you said, I mean, what if your goals weren't as lofty? What if you say, I would like to make a few $100s per month? Then, if you're going to be limited to a small site, maybe that's okay. I once saw a bird watching site in Flippa. It was a legit site. It wasn't one of these really low tier sites like you see a lot on there.
Yeah.
But when I did my homework and looked into it, while there was nothing wrong with it, I could not find the keyword opportunities I would hope for in order to grow it. If I didn't intend on growing it a lot more, hey, that's okay. But for me, that wasn't what I had in mind, so I passed on that. Now, hopefully for someone else, they're doing great with it. But like you said, if what is your goal? You could always sell it later, use that money, put it back in, or
whatever else you want. Well, you touched on keyword research. It sounds like you roll keyword research in some ways with your niche research, how you select a niche and whatnot. You're kind of looking at the keywords along with the niche. How else do you do, talk through keyword research, at least as it related to these successful sites you have, and what are some key things you do that are unique and that you think are important in your keyword research?
Okay, so why don't I just try to keep it in the scope of the typical keyword search, because I'll keep the massive list of keywords for a separate topic or something. But
okay.
So I find a seed keyword. This, by the way, a lot of times those come about accidentally, maybe at the bottom of the page, and Google's, other people search for, or I happen to run across it, or it pops into my head, and I make a note on my phone to check later. I use that seed keyword, and I'll go through. In my case, I'm using Ahrefs these days. I started with KeywordKeg originally and started moving up in tools, but I prefer to use Ahrefs. So I go through. I use some keyword filters to kind of get rid of the junk in the e-commerce stuff. So I exclude a lot of stuff, and I try to keep. But it's because I get so much data, I have to make it manageable. But let's say I get a couple hundred keywords and I'm going to go through those. So a lot of it is when I export my list, I go through manually and I look at those. And if I've scraped all entitled values, I can use that as a guide, and I highlight the cell color to try to visually just quickly narrow it down to where I want to start. But let's just say I exported a regular keyword list. I start going down through the list and I look for those that look like a topic that I can use to the best of my ability to rank for more additional keywords, as well as things that I think apply to my demographic of the site, my readers, because there's a reason they're on the website. And if also, it's nice if the search volume isn't too low. Let's say one is maybe 250. That's pretty common, I'll pick that, and I'll turn on SEO Quake in Chrome and open incognito tab, and I'll do a search result for that keyword, and I'll see what's ranking and how strong the sites are versus whatever website I'm working on. And if it's pretty close, I'll say, okay, this looks like it's probably a good one. Sometimes also, depending on how the search results turn out, I'll be sure to check what is actually in the content, because what happens sometimes is, let's say you're looking for some kind of ranch in Google search results. Unfortunately, you think you're expecting one thing, but the algorithm sometimes turns some different results, and the intent of those web pages is sometimes not what you expect. So you don't want to go into it blindly. You want to say, what is this thinking that this search query is for? Well, what I'm planning on doing fit into this or not? And if yes, then that's cool. We can go ahead if it looks like we can compete and rank. If not, maybe I should put a marker with orange and maybe come back another time. So I just kind of repeat that process. And I like these days also, my potential, once I've decided a keyword is one that looks like it's going to be a good fit for the site, and that I can rank for it realistically. So I'll put it in a content planning spreadsheet, and I'll make a note of the search volume and some other little stuff like that. man, then I can work on the content outline at that point. I tend to get like a group of them and then try to plan out the next 5 or 10 posts. So I tend to do it a handful at a time, basically.
You mentioned at the outset about the KGR method for keyword research, and I'm probably over summarizing it. Basically, that method of research tries to look for opportunities where a specific search query has been underserved in terms of the title, and thus, underserved in terms of just pages that are written about that topic. And so the idea is that if you write about that topic and you include that in the title and you write a succinct answer, you can rank quicker because there's just a gap in the SERPs for that. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of those points, but talk about how you use that as it relates to your keyword research. Is that something you use maybe more at the outset, or do you continue to use that style as you go, or how does that blend in with some of the other keyword research methods you use?
I used it when I was a beginner for SE, as much as probably even a year after starting, I was still using KGR. But so it was just and people, so I've seen a lot of discussions in those Facebook groups here and there. People are hell bent against it. They say this is not all, that's ridiculous. That's nonsense and one thing or another. But I have to try to make the point nicely that, whoa, it's not supposed to be this golden formula. It's a general rule that says that these, based on Doug and what some people knew at that time, that noticed a pattern where it's likely to be that if these two criteria are met, like if there's the all-in title values are low, and for this rough search volume 250 per month and below, that it was assuming all the other stuff, all things being equal, that you stand a good chance of ranking for it. And it was a rule of thumb, if you will, because there's no such thing as absolutes really in this line, right?
That's for sure.
Yeah. And I think unfortunately sometimes people learn that the hard way. So I used that originally, and it made a lot of sense because, why did it exist? It's because that when somebody is a beginner and they don't know what they're doing, they need some kind of plan. Because you need two things to be successful, and it's a good plan and to keep taking action. So if you don't have a plan, you're just out there and you do exactly what I've seen happen over and over and over. Somebody starts off with fire in their heart. They start off a great looking site. They're going, but they don't know how to go after keywords they can rank for, and they end up with a flop. And that's really unfortunate. It discourages people a lot, and I hate to see that. It makes people want to give up. So at least a keyword golden ratio was a way to help people start off and follow a process and get some posts up there. Because we were in Doug's group, we were doing sprints of 10 posts. That is what he recommended. So we were going about it that way. And yes, I did have, once I got out of the sandbox period, I started seeing my articles ranking. And of course, my content was at the time, but these days, after having a lot more experience, I don't use it. I do still use the all-in title factor sometimes. That's more of it, is somewhat of a filter, if you will, just to narrow down the scope of the keywords I'm going to look at. I usually go a bit off of patterns that I've learned over time. And the other process I mentioned earlier, which is manually checking them and things like that. I noticed that a person gets better the more they do it. So some of this has actually gotten easier, and I don't really need a rule of thumb per se to do it. I try to use a more general process, because when you depend on the mathematical formula of some type, that when there are other influencing factors, that leads to potential problems. Like on the KGR ratio, one thing that I noticed, I had seen this happen. What was really funny was I used to live only about 2 or 3 miles from where I worked at my last job. And the internet service provider from my workplace was different from my home, which is Comcast. So what would happen was I would scrape all in title values for keywords sometimes at home, and I would scrape them at work just a few miles apart, but they were different.
Wow.
So they were both United States. Yeah, don't get me wrong. Yeah. I just want to clear that up because that definitely can make a difference. But and I got curious about that, and for the longest time, I just hung in there. But then I realized that what this meant was I was following this rule and I was filtering this stuff out by a 0.26 ratio value, highlighting these and ignoring the others. That meant all this time, because there's a leeway that needed to be added. I'm an engineer after all. I think about math sometimes.
I can tell. I can tell.
Yeah, that meant that unfortunately, following this criteria that didn't give me any wiggle room, it meant that I probably ignored a lot of stuff out there that was actually really good. So you know what I did? I actually ran a test. I got some proxies, and I got USA proxies, and I ran proxies from one or two geographic locations on the east of the West Coast, some on the East Coast, somewhere in between, for 5 locations in the United States. And I charted in a spreadsheet the different all entitled values I got back for those, and some of them swung wildly. They were more or less in the same ballpark, but the two main points were, number one, they weren't exactly the same, which means that definitely can influence what happens if you use a ratio. Secondly, and sometimes a lot of them were extremely similar, but then there would be that one that was very different. And that right there means Joe Blow over in Montana is not going to get the same keyword golden ratio values that me over here in Atlanta would.
You're
So,
right.
That kind of made me feel better about thinking, okay, I'm going to go about this process in a more general way, relying on getting the ballpark and then evaluate it myself.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than narrow it down with a ratio first and then do it, I'll go through now and look through these.
If I were to sum up a big pivot that you've made, you can just hear it in everything you talk about. This focus on going after low competition, using different queries, different tools, different variables to try to find the lowest competition opportunities you can find. But then also using your brain. And I think that's another area that when you're starting a website, it can be really challenging to not stop and think about the queries you're going to write about, and think about if they're going to serve the reader, and go even do the research and make sure the search intent. And so balancing that really focused research approach that you're bringing with these low competition. You talk about all in title, you talked about autocomplete, you're talking about, really, really digging to try to find the lowest competition stuff out there. But also you talked about going to the SERPs, actually looking and reading what it gives you, thinking through if the query makes sense. And that balance is also hard to strike when you're brand new. It's hard to do the research, but it's also hard not to get so caught up in the research that you end up writing a bunch of articles that are pointless or that actually are the wrong target for your market. So I really like the balance that you're bringing in that approach. I think it's really good for people to hear, and I wanted to just double down on it.
And can I add something to that? I'll say that, listen, there's unfortunately, it's not, I think it's, in my opinion, it's not as bad as it used to be, but there's still so much noise out there and bad advice. So it generally boils down to basic stuff. Honestly, it does. You don't have to be a rocket scientist in order to be successful. I'm a member of Mediavine, and I'm in the Facebook group, and you should see the people who are like mom bloggers and people who make cupcakes, and they are kicking ass. So
I'm in the same
that
group.
should tell you. Oh, nice. So number one, any person could do it who really wants to. Number two, if you just go about it, a general process, the basics, the right way, you'll be okay. And
you're so right. That's such a great example, because I'm in that group too. And I'm just stunned sometimes by the amount of people that are posting and their SEO knowledge, right? And again, I'm not trying to put it down. I'm just saying the comparison of so many examples of people that are making great money, really awesome traffic, and have very little SEO knowledge. And to a T, it's because they are writing content that their users love, and people love it, and they come back for it. And they built a brand on that.
That's exactly right. I've noticed that myself too. You're right. It's a good point.
So your sites, you've got a couple sites that are successful now. I will be honest, the first time I started really catching up with you was probably in the last year or so, as there became such a big emphasis on site speed. with some of the Google's Core Web Vitals and their updates. And I will be honest, man, you have the best responses in terms of site speed to questions I see online. And
well, I appreciate it.
They're always so thorough. I felt like asking you a question once or twice, but I didn't want to put you out because I felt like you'd give me such a good answer. But I'll ask you now. So that's the best part.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Let's talk about page speed, because it's something, without bearing the lead there, you definitely put an emphasis in making sure your sites are really fast. And it looks like you've given yourself, through testing and through education, a real crash course in site speed and optimization. Can you talk about some of the big influences on site speed today, and maybe some tips for people on how to make their sites faster without needing a four-year degree in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And man, I'll tell you, this topic, sometimes I don't even deal with those threads because I see so much bad advice. A lot of the same stuff over and over, but there are some guys who are pretty smart. But I actually, technically speaking, I guess you could say that in a way, I started working in this last November, last November, before the Web Vitals thing came into play, because I used to have a theme called Rehub, which can do a variety of things. If it could be an aggregate pricing site, it could be an e-commerce site. I used the basic theme, and it was intended to be for general affiliate sites or whatever you need. And it was a nice site and all that, but doggone it, man. When I did page speed test back then, it turned out to be not very good, despite the ads, which is pretty typical theme providers. It's very fast and reading, but it's not actually.
It's not actually.
So, no. And it had so much CSS loading. Oh my gosh. It had all these features, but that comes with a price, because the features need styling, and CSS is the code that does the styling for things like buttons and little drop downs and short codes and yada yada. And by that time, I did some testing. I compared Astra and GeneratePress, and ended up settling on GeneratePress, and I changed my themes over, or my sites over from Rehub to GeneratePress. I'm really glad I did it. Was it a lot of work? Yes. But they're much leaner and fast. They were much leaner, faster, but it wasn't as great as I'd hoped for. So I learned the lesson that just changing your theme, even if you get an awesome one, isn't really the underlying issue. There's more to the story. So it wasn't too long before, yada. So it was like in January, I was in Medellin, Colombia, and I decided to start cracking down on this. And I really should have been writing more content, but I'm so curious about this stuff sometimes, but I started really digging in very, very deep. And at the time, I still used to have Elementor Pro. I used it on my homepage for a variety of things, and also some category pages. And I started digging in further. And by the time the page speed inside Google's testing tool rolled around and more information was out there, I was having a better idea what I was looking for. So what I noticed was things like a traditional page builder, like WP Bakery, which is also called Visual Composer, or Elementor, or one of the others. It was loading an enormous amount of CSS and JavaScript. And by that time, I figured out that plugins were adding a lot of overhead. And I got some of those under control by using, there's one called Perf Matters. And there's another plugin called Asset Cleanup Pro.
That's the one I've heard of, yeah.
That's what I'm using, because it gave me a little bit more control over the.
I'm probably using it because you recommended it.
Yeah, it's not as user friendly, but it's, if you're willing to learn, it gave me a little bit more control. More code showed up that I got control over that, and the other one did when I tried it too, because I tested both of them. But anyway, I saw that this tool, both those tools, they'll let you actually let you see what's actually being loaded in one of your poster pages. It is very informative, because you'll see it could be just like 20 kilobytes of CSS, but then you'll say, wow, it's loading the JavaScript and I'm not even using any of this. So you're taking a hit on page speed for all this stuff that's not, a lot of times is not even being used. What's even crazier is, in some instances, you'll have a email, your contact form, like in your contact page. You would think that would only be used on that page, but no, some of them will load all the way across your site. So we're completely irrelevant to pages and posts, loading this overhead as well. So using a plugin like Asset Cleanup, you can just disable what's loaded based on on all posts or all pages or individually or with some rule you can set up, which is pretty nice. So that made a big difference. So by that time I was getting into the low to mid 90s. And I was still with SiteGround at the time, which isn't really all that fast, or when I was there, it wasn't. And I wasn't on the bottom tier either. I was on a mid-tier SiteGround plan for hosting. So I discovered that Elementor was loading all this CSS and JavaScript. And I've heard people even try to argue that, oh, well, mine is blazing fast and I have Elementor, but then they're not really passing Web Vitals and they're still in the 90s, which is cool if that's all you care about. But let's not pretend that it's not holding you back from what's possible, because I took Elementor off and evaluated the results I got and what was being loaded in, let's say my homepage, for example, which was a headache for a while. And there was definitely a large difference because as it turns out, there's a built-in feature in browsers like Chrome and Edge, Microsoft Edge. If you right click with your mouse and go to inspect, it'll open a little developer style series of windows and things like that. You can see the code that's loaded. You can look at little elements and check the CSS and tweak it with it. You can also see the code that's loaded, and it'll even show you how much is used or unused. Mm-hmm. And I had I remember it's like 200 or 220 kilobytes of CSS code alone uploaded by Elementor on my homepage. And it was like 95% was not even used at all. And I thought, I'm still struggling with it. I spent a lot of time on this, just one thing after another, working on this stuff. I gotten my sites very lean and fast, but this was kind of this last thing. And I thought, well, at this point, I'm going to spend a lot more time and effort trying to maybe chip down these files and get it down to something custom that's very lean. Or I could just move on and get something that's easier that won't give me this problem. And besides, also at that time, Elementor just increased their pricing too. And I thought, yeah, it's an easy decision. So I got rid of Elementor. I was very happy that I did that. I removed a lot of files from from WordPress as well, by the way, when you remove it, something like that. So I did that, and I used a plugin that's by the same guys who make GeneratePress. It's called WP Show Posts. So I replaced my Elementor post grids on my homepage and my nice looking little post grids and stuff. I tried a lot of others out there. I paid versions of a lot of out there, and they were crap. They were loading a lot of code. They were using like Ajax, which is another, I think it's a software framework, but and they were also, I took a big hit of page speed with all those. I spent so much time trying it, and I went to WP Show Post. Man, huge difference, very fast. I tweaked it, customized it. I even got it looking, I got their help to help me make it look like my original website before I had Elementor, which is really great. So now it's very, very lean. What was really interesting was my contact page, because I used to use WP Forms, which is a pretty well-known plugin. And it's nice and all that. But if you don't use, I've tried using Honeypot feature in some contact forms they have, and it just didn't work, stop spam. I didn't have any luck with it. Yeah. So a lot of people use CAPTCHAs, but the problem was it was loading JavaScript and it hurt my page speed also. And I know the contact page is not really that big of a deal because, how many people visit that? But I thought, well, I want my whole site to be great.
You were committed at this point.
I was committed. I was pretty committed because I made it this far. And what I ended up doing was I got Contact Form 7, which is very, very lean. Mm-hmm. And I basically redid what I had done before, which wasn't very hard. And I got this idea. I remember I was talking to my friends when I was still in Colombia, and I said, hey, look at this. So I made my own CAPTCHA. So my CAPTCHA is just a CAPTCHA image that I made. And I've seen a pattern where they kind of use a grainy image. It has the characters inside, but it's kind of grainy. The idea is that a bot can't read it like human eyes can. And I made an image like that. And in Contact Form 7, you can have people enter a little quiz box. So I just had the quiz entry be the same text as what was in the picture. And guess what? It worked. It is super light. it's so, and I got like a 9900 on that on my contact page finally.
You are such an engineer for the record.
Well, I don't know. Was it 10%? Inspiration, 90% perspiration or something.
Yep. Well, let me recap for those because I took notes. I mean, it sounds like the theme was a big deal for you.
Yeah,
And
it was a big
using, in
deal.
your case, to generate press. You also talked about Astra, but
Yeah.
switching off of a heavy theme, that was a big
Yeah,
play.
exactly.
You talked about using asset cleanup to really identify what JavaScript and CSS is being loaded per page and either
Exactly.
delaying it or getting rid of it on pages.
Exactly.
You touched on page builders, specifically Elementor, and how you moved off of Elementor, and then you used WP Show Posts, which is, and Gutenberg now has their own built-in blocks now. I think right? I haven't used it myself, but
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talk about those block-based builders, and I haven't used that personally, but I know people are happy with those things too.
yeah.
So don't let me discount those things also, because those are in the same genre. I guess I'm trying to say.
Yeah, your big thing was moving off of basically
Yeah.
a page builder like an Elementor. I mean, I know back in the
Yeah.
day, like Thrive Architect was a big one that we all used for a period of time. And then you also touched on plugins, and really a lot of, you focused on the contact form, but just in general as a plugin weight that can come, and how you're not necessarily, that's a good spot to target as well. Any other things that are important? I mean, I jotted down some notes in terms of like how important is hosting, how important are image sizes, the fonts you're using, caching plugins, or even caching built in with your host. How important are some of those things?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because that was another big factor. And I think I've noticed a lot of times people start off the hosting first, or the theme, and not really work on the fundamental causes, the root causes of the problem. So in my case, I was itching to get off SiteGround because, like a lot of people know, the renewal prices go way up. Anyway, I got done with cleaning up the underlying causes, like the code overhead and things like that, after I changed things and getting rid of Elementor. So at that point, my sites were pretty freaking fast and pretty lean, but they still weren't all the way. They were like in the 90s in page speed insights, and there was still a little bit of, I wasn't quite passing web vitals at the time. I was on the threshold. So with traditional shared hosting, what I've learned is that even when I wasn't using the bottom tier SiteGround hosting, I was using GrowBig at that point is their plan. Unfortunately, even on with a good company, it's shared hosting, so there's a huge amount of websites sitting on the same server,
right,
and the performance is just not that great. So unfortunately, with shared hosting, intermittent delays are also an issue. I first started seeing this because I did so much page speed testing to, trial and error, that what I noticed over time was with these hosts, in my case, SiteGround, but I've seen it on others too, that sometimes it'll be pretty good, and then the next time it'll be like really bad, and it'll even be a severe delay over 1 second. Sometimes to some crazy number much bigger than that. So you can't really count on them for consistent performance. And my time to first byte, which is you can look up what that means on the internet, but it's one of the when you first start getting data coming from the server to load in your browser, it was like on average somewhere around 330 milliseconds, which 15 years ago that would probably be considered good, but these days that's not very good. So I tested some other hosts. I had in the past, I've had WPX, which is still rated to be pretty fast. I tried this one, I tried that one, and I heard about Cloudways. So I set up a site there. I actually ported it over to try it out, and I did testing through PageSpeed Insights, or webpagetest.org, as well as GTmetrix, which I only use for some fundamental stuff. And guess what? My time to first byte and load times were pretty consistent, and the time to first byte was, even on their entry level plan, was like 90 milliseconds.
Oh wow!
So it was like, that's a factor of that's almost 4 times as fast for the first load. So because I had gotten the basics done right, and I made a decision to leave SiteGround, when I moved to Cloudways, I made it. I passed. I finally got past the goal line. My web vitals went to green.
Yep.
So it wasn't, again,
in your case, hosting was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
But it might not have been as big a deal if you hadn't taken care of a lot of the other things.
Exactly. Because if you don't do the other stuff right, how can you really tell what's going to make a difference?
Yeah. Because
I like to think of it as if you put a bunch of concrete blocks in the back of a car, if you're still dragging those cars around all over town, you should ask yourself, why is this so slow? you know, you should say, what am I doing that I need to get rid of first, and then worry about getting a bigger motor later.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good analogy. That's well, I'm sure we could talk about site speed tweaks all day. But I mean, I think this was a really good punch list for people. And if you're struggling with getting your site faster, and yes, I think it's worth touching on, Core Web Vitals and the rollout and whether it impacts search rankings or how much it impacts search rankings, that we'll debate on for probably years to come. But even if you remove those topics, just the better experience for your users and the ability to get more people engaging in your website. I mean, you can't underscore that importance.
Yeah, I know, and you actually save some stuff. For example, I don't need a CDN. That's one of the things I see people always say that you should do, but I don't need a CDN at all. It's not really necessary. If you go, maybe it doesn't apply to all cases, but for me, it wasn't even necessary at all. And what also would happen was, because I took it off so much stuff, and I also did some cleanup work and some old files from old plugins in WordPress. But my bandwidth is actually lower now because there's less data moving, because there's so much crap that's not there anymore.
Oh.
So it's my bandwidth has gone down, which means it's actually possible sometimes. That site has, like, my second site has, I think at the time it had like let's say it had 75 posts. And it still had a lot of traffic. Beginning of the year, I had like 100,000 visitors on my second site. And even with that site, I was still able to fit my site and manage to use the basic tier, the cheapest hosting plan with Cloudways at the time, because it wasn't moving near as much data as it used to.
Right. There's so much lighter.
My page, a couple 100 kilobytes for a page, and that's with images and ads loading.
Wow. And that's with ads. That's a good point. This is all with ads. Mediavine. Well, let's bring this back full circle here as we kind of come to a close. Let's talk just a bit about where you're at today. I mean, you're now full-time on websites. If you can share any data you're comfortable with, how much your websites are earning or traffic they're getting. What part of the world are you living in now? I mean, you talked about travel and lifestyle being so important. Let's bring all this back full circle.
Yeah, so I just recently it's my first time in Europe. So I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia. I have to clarify, because not all Americans have heard of the country Georgia, because I'm from the state Georgia.
I was about to say you were from Georgia, and now you're in Georgia, but a totally different country.
Yes, totally different, very different, way different language.
I bet.
So I guess I did take earlier this year, unfortunately, on a second site, I took a little bit of hit in traffic, so I'm building it back up. So I took a little bit of dip in income, but between that, I still have some Amazon affiliate posts, but majority of my income is now display ad revenue. So let's see, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So I don't know what, let's just say somewhere under, maybe it was around ballpark around $5,000 combined, and I started a new project, which is just going to be informational site. And I've already got 163 posts on that. So that's my first foray into scaling up, outsourcing the writing. I still write my own content for my technically oriented posts, because it's just requires that level of knowledge, and I care about what I put out there. But for my new one, I spend a lot of time doing content planning, and it's about to start earning money pretty soon. And then I'm just going to reinvest the money. So these principles I learned from very successful people like John Dykstra and others, and Spencer does something similar too. I'm going to follow what works and just repeat the process and trust the process. So it's tough that I've been having the last couple of months. Gosh, it's been 6-8 months. I've been investing, over $1,000 each month just into X number of posts per month. And I'm not trying to get the cheapest. I'm trying to get a good compromise between good quality and something affordable. So it takes you have to stay focused and keep faith that this is going to pay off. But I'm constantly taking action. I'm not stopping. So I'm starting to see the results. The traffic is rapidly rising in this new project, and I'm just going to keep scaling it and then go from there. I hope if I've answered your question. I don't know.
You definitely did. No, you did. I mean, I'll close by saying this. I absolutely love having people like you on the podcast because, I mean, it's just a wonderful story. It's emblematic and it's not accidental, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
this is not something that you happened into. This is not something that, you found yourself in a very frustrating position and you looked at yourself, but that's only the beginning of the story. I mean, this is a very clear, I think over the last hour we've seen, you've been incredibly purposeful about every single facet of what you've done to change your story. And here you are now living in Europe, completely free of the things that were frustrating you from before, successful, and really an expert in this now. I mean, an expert at what you're doing. I mean, and it's wonderful to learn from you, but equally as much, it's just really inspiring to hear your story and how successful you've become.
It's very, very kind of you. I appreciate it. On this note, I want to say that I always try my best to encourage people to listen to really good podcasts like this, because this is a very good, well done podcast. And I tell people, listen, these guys are interviewing the people, and they're asking you real questions that you'll learn something that you won't hear otherwise, and that's invaluable. You can't put a price on a guy who's making 6 figures a month saying, this is how I do it. Mm-hmm. There's your answer. If you're willing to learn, don't pass up the opportunity to get the right information. Listen to the people who actually walk the walk, And, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with people like you. And I listen to the podcast too, and I enjoy it a lot. There's always something more to learn. I never think I know too much. What's interesting is I just came to accept that learning is a part of the process, and you're going to be a different person in 6 months than you were when you started. And that's cool. It's cool if you screw up. You could screw up 10 times in a row. That's okay. If you say, I did something wrong, but I'm willing to figure out what I did wrong, and you keep going forward. Really, that's the basic of what it takes. Be thinking like that, as opposed to, well, I can't do this, or listen to people who tell you can't. Because unfortunately, that happens. I know from personal experience. That's one reason I try to be the voice of encouragement, because I know how it is sometimes. It's unfortunate, but it's just how the world is. There's a lot of negativity, so we need more of the opposite. my 2 cents.
I agree with you, and I think that you're living that. I think you're living that out. So, thanks so much for being here, Marty. I appreciate you joining us. It's been a great interview. It's been a great time chatting with you, and thanks for sharing so much knowledge.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Talk soon.
Okay.